Good morning, everybody. Apologies for that job title. It's the reflection of a restructure that we had recently due to the austerity that we're currently facing, so I'm sure you'll understand. It's fantastic to be here. Apart from being blinded by the lights that are shining on my face, I should add at that point. We always sort of make a point of trying to understand what's happening in other countries. I'm quite influenced by a quote from an author called William Gibson. And Gibson said, the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And what's happening in other places is quite possible that it's going to happen to us in the future. I'm going to talk to you today about our experience of the big society, and what I'd like to do, I've been given 40 minutes to talk. I'd like to give you some context about how we arrived at the point where the big society was being implemented. I'd then like to briefly reflect on this idea of, is this just a short-term change that we're going through? Is this a blip, or is this the new normal? Then try and explain to you a little bit about the matter of the big society, which I have to say has confused an awful lot of people in Britain. So quite how you look at this from thousands of miles away, I think, is interesting. And then I want to sort of help you think through about what the lessons are. So what are the opportunities and threats, but also what are some of the myths and realities as well. By the way, can you understand my accent okay? Yeah? Some of my colleagues in London can't understand my accent, so there you go. So, what is the context? How did we arrive at this point? Well, I know in Canada you had the Accord. Well, in the UK we had the Compact, which was an agreement between the national government and the voluntary sector about how we wanted to move forward together. It was sort of, for the boxing fans amongst you, it was a bit like the Queensberry rules for relations between government and the voluntary sector. And over the last 15 years, I think we've very much experienced a process where we've been what the academics call mainstreamed in public policy design and also delivery. We've had a seat at the table, in other words. And with that seat at the table, we've seen that there have been significant increases in resources, and particularly earned income. We have a really annoying debate in the UK at the minute about how you have social enterprises over here and charities over here. Actually, they're not that different, and charities have become much more enterprising. But alongside that increase in resources, most of which has come from working with governments, we've found that it's been more difficult to maintain and grow social action. So volunteering and levels of giving and philanthropy, by and large, have been flat. And in that process of change that we've gone through in the last 15 years, there have clearly been winners and losers. Some of the winners have been the largest charities. So we have a big supermarket in the UK called Tesco's, which has a very disproportionate share of the grocery market in the UK. And people refer to this phrase Tescoisation, where smaller or mid-size charities and voluntary organisations have struggled to compete or to get a share of resources. Just before I make my final point, I'm going to try and draw out some lessons for you as we go along. And the lessons I was thinking about here is first of all, be careful what you wish for. Prior to the Compact years, everybody wanted a much closer relationship with governments. They wanted to be involved much more in delivery of services and shaping policy. And crikey, guys, when it comes along, it's difficult. And it requires commitment and it requires time. And I must admit, I reflect back and I do find myself wondering about all those voluntary organisations complaining of consultation fatigue, that they were too involved in the design of public policy. So if you're going to argue for engagement and closer involvement, be clear that it's a different world, that it requires a different mindset. I think also looking back, what I reflect upon is that more resources coming into the sector is a good thing. So listening to Jim then, the fact that there are potentially more resources coming in is a good thing. But it's not just about the level of resources, it's also about where those resources go. And one of the things I'd ask you to just reflect upon is the potential tension between the organisations that are the haves and the have-nots, and the concern that sometimes the component parts of the sector are at risk of being in conflict with each other about resources. They're potentially likely to float apart because they have different dynamics when more resources come in. So we had a fantastic period. It took us right pretty much up until the end of the decade. It's what the the Governor of the Bank of England referred to as the nice decade. Non-inflationary continuous expansion for the policy geeks amongst you, or what we now recognise is what we call peak funding. That was possibly as good as it was going to get in the medium term. And at that point, enter the financial crisis and enter a recession as well. We're having lots of debates in the UK at the minute about, is this just a sort of a short-term issue? Is it 3 years? Or actually, is it the new normal? And again, if you're thinking long-term and thinking about the future here, I'd ask you to just consider what the demographics of most Western societies look like at the minute. And the fact that we have an ageing population and that it is our seniors who make a disproportionate sort of demand upon many of the services that we are trying to deliver as societies. And dealing with that demographic impact in terms of aging, but also some of the other trends that we know about. So we know that there is, again, what the policy geeks call atomization in society. More people are living alone. People aren't perhaps quite as connected. They might be further away from their families than they used to be in previous generations. So dealing with some of those demographic changes is going to put long-term pressure on societies in terms of cohesion, but also in terms of providing services. So whilst we have some quite serious short-term reductions in funding, I think there are long-term pressures in terms of how we provide services, and government can't find the solutions to those problems on its own. It very much needs to work with voluntary organisations and businesses to find those solutions. We've invested a lot in infrastructure over the last decade. I think those reductions that we are seeing now reflect another focus that we're seeing in the UK, which is this idea that we want to focus as much as possible of our resources on frontline delivery in voluntary organisations. Certainly in our country, we perhaps have a vision of voluntary organisations that is much more based around the delivery of services. There's, well, I suppose, a dislike of organisations that campaign. And I love Jim's expression, hold their feet to the fire. I couldn't agree more. The expression that we use in the UK is that we must speak truth to power. And I would encourage you to ensure that you keep to do that. And quite bizarrely, sometimes large charities are seen as part of the problem at the moment. They are seen as bureaucratic organisations, and what we really need to return to are very much smaller grassroots organisations who are providing services in their locality, and I'll come back to that later on. Before I make my final point again, the lessons I would say to you is how quickly the weather can change. Yeah, I was walking around the Rockies yesterday and I was thinking how quickly the weather can change, but how quickly the political and the financial weather can change as well, okay? Again, these are difficult things for me to say, but I think we got a bit too comfortable in terms of our relationship with government. And I'm all for engagement, but again, always have an eye on the long term. And strategic planning. The other thing that I think that we found is I'm rather tired of people being told that we should have seen the cuts in public spending coming, and we should have seen what the implications of the financial crisis would be. Well, knowing that there is a storm coming and being able to prepare for that storm and then action your plan quite often are two quite different things we found. So, I think that this is the new normal, and whilst the economy in Canada is quite possibly much better than the economy in the UK, nevertheless those underlying pressures in terms of our societies are there, so we have to work with government to find a solution. So, enter the big society, and in particular enter this idea that we want a bigger society, and ergo we would like a smaller state. I don't know if you know this woman. She continues to divide opinion in the UK, I think it's fair to say. And of the many things that Mrs. Thatcher said in her time in office, one of the things that's most often quoted, and to be frank, probably misquoted, is something that she said, which the nub of which was, there is no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women, and there are families. The Guardian newspaper in the UK, in response to that, actually started a new weekly section called Society in response to Mrs. Thatcher's point about society. For what it's worth, I think she's probably been misquoted. But one of the legacies of Mrs. Thatcher was that the Conservative Party was very much keen to re-argue the points that it wasn't just there for business, it was also there about producing a more cohesive society. So in some respects, David Cameron's taking forward of the phrase big society and his vision underlying that is very much a response to what Mrs. Thatcher said about no such thing as society. So I have to turn away here because I can't read my notes closely enough, but it says, where people in their everyday lives don't always turn to officials, local authorities or central government for answers to the problems they face, but instead they feel both free and powerful enough themselves to help themselves and their own communities. So the big society, essentially, it's about individual responsibility. It's about communities and individuals taking on more of a sense of responsibility for their own welfare. It's about increasing social action, and yes, it's about a smaller state. They tend not to talk too much about a smaller state, but realistically, the big society is essentially about rethinking and quite possibly shrinking the role of the state. There's been an awful lot of confusion about what we mean by the big society. If you look at opinion polls of the public, I think over half of the public don't understand what the Prime Minister means by the big society, and quite often it's been conflated with just more giving and more volunteering. And people who are quite worried about their public services at the moment see this in some cases, and of course this is from a political perspective, as just an attempt on the part of the Prime Minister to reduce state spending on services that they value. This chart here is from the Cabinet Office, and it talks about what the main elements of that big society agenda are. So first of all, it talks about social action and how we would like to increase social action in our country. It talks about how we want to reform public services and quite possibly get to a situation that's more like you have here in Canada, where non-profit or voluntary organisations have a much greater role. And then finally, it would like to increase levels of community engagement, and in particular, this idea that people feel empowered to take more responsibility for their services. And then they talk about mechanisms to make the big society happen. So too much central or federal government, in your case, and devolve much more power, not just to provincial governments as it would be here, but to individual cities. Secondly, by much more transparency in government, okay? I don't know how much the open data agenda has made inroads into your thinking here, but much more transparency is an example. And then finally, new forms of finance, and I will talk about those new forms of finance in a minute. Underpinning these mechanisms and these policy areas, there are a number of individual programs, and I could probably bore you to death this morning by talking about those programs, but what I've tried to do is pick out some of those things that give you a flavour. Okay. Has anybody heard of nudge theory? Okay. Because this is a right-of-centre government, it doesn't like telling people what to do. It doesn't like deregulation, and if anything, actually part of the big society agenda is a bonfire of regulation. But what it thinks it can do instead is listen to the advice of a couple of American academics called Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, and it's this idea that you can frame the choices that people make. You can nudge them into making decisions that ultimately are what they call pro-social, or in favour of society. So to give you an example here, this picture here is, these are called the piano steps. Okay, we have a problem with obesity in the UK, and we want to encourage people to take more physical exercise. Well, in this little social experiment, what they found was that when they painted the steps on the left-hand side of the escalator like a piano keyboard, and then when people walked up the piano keyboard and they made the notes that those keys on a piano make, people used the steps instead of the escalator. Okay, there are lots of experiments like this. There's another one called the speed camera lottery, where every time you go past a speed camera, if you're under the limit, you get entered into a lottery to win the fines from the people that exceed the speed limit. The idea being that you encourage pro-social behaviour. So the idea is that we can take experiments like this, and if you give people the information that they if you can give them sort of stimuluses, you shape their responses. So, for example, there are some really good experiments in the UK that show if you compare recycling rates on different streets, and then if those recycling rates are different, if you show the streets with the lower recycling rates what the proportion recycling are in the best streets, the averages all go upwards. People change their behaviour because they see what other people are doing. And there are other examples like this. So the most cited one is that you can encourage people to give at cash machines because you create an environment where it's the natural pro-social behaviour to do. A lesson here, nudge theory can work, and it can work very well. But if government tries to do the nudging, it has the opposite effect to which you intend. Seems to be the lesson so far. So that's one example of the big society. Has anybody come across social impact bonds at all? Okay, so a few of you. So this is the point about new forms of finance, and I know this is something, and social finance I know is an issue that you're going to address at the conference. But broadly speaking, the idea around big society is that we can move from a funding environment of grants to a financing environment of bonds, of loans, of quasi-equity. We're trying to develop a social stock exchange in the UK at the moment. And the idea of these, and this is the point not just for voluntary organisations but for business as well, about how can we continue to provide public services for a much more demanding population that's ageing as well. And here the idea of social impact bonds is that you have a payment by results system. So you only get payment as voluntary organisations if you can prove that you have delivered the outcomes that you promised at the beginning of the contract. So the first experiment is taking place at the minute in a place called Peterborough, where the local prison in Peterborough, charities and voluntary organisations are working with ex-offenders, and if they can reduce the recidivism rate of those ex-offenders, they'll be paid. And if they can reduce the recidivism rate by more than they originally, more than the benchmark, they'll be paid even more. But if they don't deliver, they won't be paid. This is a fundamental change, I'm sure I don't need to say, in terms of how we might contract with voluntary organisations. Lessons so far from there, and I know you're talking again about social finance here today. Well, there's almost a wall of money there available waiting to be taken up to fund these new approaches. But we have a big problem that voluntary organisations are not investment ready, to coin a phrase. Trustees, for example, are quite risk averse and they don't want to take on loans or social investment. I'd also suggest that some of the financial intermediaries that are proposing these ideas, they're not investee ready. I'm still learning how to use phrases like deal flow and capstone finance and so on, which are quite alien to me. And I mean, my colleagues are also finding these things difficult. However, there are real opportunities here, and to quote another public policy official, we have the opportunity in the UK to move from a position where finance is socially useless to a position where finance is socially useful. There's a whole backstory to that, which I won't bore you with. Oh, my apologies. Am I boring you, by the way? No? Okay. You never know. One of the other things that the government is also particularly interested in is essentially how can you take parts of government and spin them out, to use its expression, and put them into the non-profit sector. So it has a process of what it's calling mutualisation, where it wants to spin out bits of our health service, for example, and give control of those organisations over to the staff that are working in them. So what it's calling public service mutuals. And they're very interested, of course, in the rich history of cooperation that we have in the UK as well. This is still very much a moving target, and I recognise that the position here in Canada is a little different. But one of the things that this is highlighting, and a potential lesson that I think we might turn to at the end, is that the boundaries between the sectors are blurring all the time. And actually, it's getting more difficult in some cases to distinguish where the public sector ends and where the voluntary sector begins. And actually, when you look at areas like social enterprise as well, sometimes it can be quite difficult to know where the private sector ends and the voluntary sector begins. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And I think we should talk about that in our Q&A. Other examples, they're introducing a national citizens service, which is getting young people to volunteer. There's also a program around community organising. So how can we train community organisers in our localities to encourage people to get more involved? And then finally, there are a number of programs that are about trying to encourage levels of giving, whether that's giving time or giving money. There's a particular focus on philanthropy, so giving at the very top end. And there's also a huge interest in new technology, and in particular, how can we use some of these new platforms to encourage giving and to facilitate giving. If that's something that's of interest to you, there's an American academic at Stanford University called Lucy Bernholtz, who has a manifesto called Disruptive Philanthropy. Lucy talks about how social change increasingly is going to be data-driven. If this is an area that interests you, I would urge you to look at Lucy's work because I think it's fascinating and I think it's very useful. We are, as Catherine well knows, we're engaged in a minor spat with the Treasury at the minute about their approach to giving as part of the big society. They've made some quite serious changes to the tax system that reduce the tax advantages for giving, which has caused all sorts of ructions. So I suppose a lesson so far from me in the UK around giving is that the tax system does matter, and you play with it at your peril, I would suggest. So, it's early days. We're still in the stages of implementation, but I do think it's worth thinking about what some of the myths and realities are of that implementation. Well, first of all, and I'm not quite sure what the newspapers are reporting here. I know I've certainly spoken to the Globe and Mail before about big society, and they've reported on cynicism. I would suggest to you that the big society is dead. The Prime Minister doesn't use the phrase very much anymore, and he talks about a bigger society rather than the big society. No one else really talks about it. However, the policies that underpin the big society, so the work programme and the ideology, they're very much alive, and they are not going away. So the brand, big society, is dead, but the policies are long living. I think for me, one of the learnings that I've had so far is how poor public understanding of the voluntary sector is. And I don't know if that's wildly different in the UK, but we seem to be quite hooked on terms like charity and volunteering, when actually the range of social action and the range of support and the types of support that we benefit from and encourage are much broader than that. We've been trying to talk about citizen participation and engagement and talking about all those different types of support, but it's very difficult to move our public at large beyond notions of giving and volunteering. And that's despite being in the eye of the media for pretty much of the last 18 months. So I think our work with the media and the media's understanding and its role in promoting voluntary sector is something that, again, we should think about in the future. I've had a few conversations over the last few days with people here about engagement and how we engage with government. And I think Jim's points before me were pretty important, actually. We've gone through a phase we've elected a right-wing government after 14 years of a left-wing government. And to be frank, there are lots of people who work in the voluntary sector who are quite uncomfortable with that. Many people who work in the sector are left of centre, to be frank. They've just opposed the big society, and they've been quite rude about the big society, to be frank. And they haven't tried to engage around the issues. They've just focused on the politics. I find that quite disappointing, actually. And even if you might not agree with what your government here is going to do, you have to engage. And in particular, you have to engage and you have to think about, well, if you don't engage and if all you do is just disagree and oppose, what is the plan B available to your government? Because I think quite often the plan B is to just ignore communities and just go over your head. So that is a lesson that I certainly would learn from us. I think another lesson is about the scale of voluntary action. We have, if there's one fallacy that I think has harmed the big society so far, it's this idea that if the state withdraws from an area of activity, a bit like a gas, the voluntary sector will just take its place. It will occupy the space vacated by the state. I don't think it's wildly different in Canada, but we're just not of a scale that we can suddenly take over huge swathes of public services in a way that was envisaged. And this does actually highlight another point, a related point for me, which is the issue about scaling up. I worry that not just in the UK, but actually globally when it comes to non-profit organisations, I think we're becoming a little bit obsessed with scaling up, and not just scaling up to national level organisations, but scaling up globally as well. And I'd question, is it always about scaling up and bigger organisations, or is it actually about replication of ideas? And scaling up the ideas rather than just scaling up the organisations. I talked about that unease with the big society in our sector. Well, there's definitely an unease in terms of our relationship with business. And again, some of our attitudes towards the private sector are, to be frank, quite disappointing. There is a narrative sometimes in our sector that if you work in the private sector, I mean, you're only interested in personal benefit. Almost there are horns growing out of your head. This is clearly nonsense. We have many shared aims and indeed many shared values. I think one of the other disappointing things that I've experienced in relation to the private sector is that too often when we see our relationships with the private sector, we see companies as glorified cash machines, just sort of there for the purposes of CSR, and we hope we can extract some money from them. The new reality of public service delivery in the UK is that actually one of the best ways that we can work with private sector organisations is actually by being part of their supply chain and thinking about how we work with them to deliver services. That, of course, is not all perfect and it's not all going well. Some of that supply chain management is not working, and some of our capitalism is not responsible. So in public services, and specifically working with unemployed people, there are some practices in terms of supply chain management that are not very nice, and I can talk to you about those later. So, lessons for Canada. Policy's not very joined up in the UK. I hope it's a little bit better in the US, but the implication of that is that you have to engage constantly, not just to influence, but also to build understanding. Yeah, you can't do this as an episodic exercise. You have to do this as a continuous engagement, I would suggest to you. And I would suggest particularly organisations like CCVO are fundamental in that engagement. And you have to provide them with your support, and in particular provide them with evidence of what is happening on the ground. Very difficult for organisations like CCVO to influence and inform without the evidence that you provide. We're cutting public spending in the UK at the minute. That means that building that big society is quite difficult. I talked about social finance. One of the things that worries me is that we are going to move the pendulum from one end of the spectrum that's all about grants, and that pendulum is going to swing right to the other end of the spectrum, and it's all going to be about finance, and that finance will replace grants. I think a real bit of learning is that you need funding diversity. If we are going to envisage a much greater role for social finance, sort of the there, well, the here is quite a long way from the there, and it's going to take a long time to build investment readiness as well. I've talked about scale already. The last one for us is potentially a problem. We worry a lot about independence. I've suggested to you all the way through here that I think engagement is a good thing, but you always have to remember that we should and will work with governments, but ultimately you need to think about the times that you do need to oppose. So as Jim said before, always feel that you can still hold their feet to the fire. The big society in the UK has also highlighted that there are an awful lot of opportunities going forward. I think it's most probably the same here, but never ever underestimate the resilience of communities in times of difficulty. Never underestimate just how many good ideas and how much activism will always continue to come from the grassroots. I think we've actually become very cynical about our generation, about current generations, and about the extent to which they're prepared to get involved. So we talk about slacktivism, for example, of the millennials. I don't agree with it. I think people will engage, but it's our role to then mobilise them. I think lessons for us is that capacity building has worked, and I know that you're going to talk about capacity at some point. So building the back office infrastructure of organisations means that we're stronger than we were. So if you're going to escape that non-profit starvation cycle, make sure you invest in capacity. Social finance in terms of the opportunity, I think the biggest opportunity around social finance is that it will grow the cake. If we can think about its role in terms of growing the cake and bringing new forms of finance to the sector, I think that's where it can add most value. Again, skipping forward, one of the things that we're trying to do in the UK is asset transfer and asset sharing. There's much more co-location of services where voluntary organisations are actually working out of buildings previously occupied just by local government, and we're finding that that's actually encouraging and supporting cultures of collaboration. I would encourage that as well. I've talked already around new technology. We're shifting from an analog to a digital world. I can bore you to death on that one because that's one of my pet subjects, but I will leave it there. And then this sort of ferment of ideas that the big society debate has produced. So the beginning of today was very much about holding the conversations. Maintaining those conversations is absolutely critical because the cut and thrust of debate around these issues I've found is really good. Normally at this point, I now say, right, I'm going to conclude. But almost what I wanted to sort of get across to you is that this is not the conclusion. There's still very much to do. There's still lots of things to think about. But in as much as I will conclude, I want to say, despite some quite sort of, well, I suppose negative things I might have said about how it's going so far, I actually remain incredibly optimistic around voluntary action and voluntary sector and how we can work with those other sectors to help society. There's a group of people in the UK that describe themselves as militant optimists. Well, I hope I'm one of them. The image that I have there is a book called Handmade. It's written by a wonderful lady called Tessie Britton. And what Tessie has done there is she's tried to draw together all the examples of social action that are happening in our communities at the minute. And she's highlighting the new ways that people are trying to encourage social action, the new ways that people are trying to trying to deliver public services. And she's highlighting the constant innovation that's taking place in our communities that doesn't get recognised. MTV, for example, they're referring to the millennials now as the innovation generation. And that generation, what I think is particularly pertinent to the debate today, they don't see sectors. They just see outcomes that they want to achieve for communities. So the final thought I want to leave you with is, quite rightly, the discussion today is about the debate and the interchange between the sectors, but can we actually get to a point where we don't think about sectors anymore? Can we actually get to a point where we are just thinking about communities and outcomes, and we stop focusing on the barriers between sectors and we focus instead on our common values, on our common goals, and hopefully our common language as well? Thank you.